Ford, get back in.
Okay. I don't know, we're coming over the west there, and they want you to come back in now.
Roger, we've been trying to talk to you for a while here.
No, back in, come on. You still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy.
(1965) marked the 15th year since scientists first used this triangular tract of scrubland for missile testing. Today, Cape Kennedy is the focal point of the United States commitment in space. The year opened with two pieces of unfinished business. Mariner, a complex spacecraft launched on November 28, 1964, was in the early phases of a 350-million-mile journey to the planet Mars. And GT-2, the unmanned Gemini spacecraft, still sat atop the modified Titan II booster on Complex 19 after a December fizzle. These missions were completed. GT-2 was successfully launched in January. In July, Mariner zeroed in on its target to give scientists the first close-up pictures of Mars. 1965 was the year of promise at Cape Kennedy. Promise for real achievement in manned spaceflight. Promise for a military boost in space with the first flights of the Air Force Titan 3C. Promise for more muscle for the nation's deterrent strength by refinement of the latest ballistic missile weapon system. Promise for advancement across a broad front of scientific investigation with unmanned satellites. The programs at the Cape, which only a few years ago were science fiction, are today becoming science fact. This is the Thor Delta rocket at work. It evolved from an early Air Force weapons program and is now an operational space booster used by Air Force and NASA for most satellite launches. The satellites launched in 1965 gave the U.S. valuable scientific information to study magnetic fields, cosmic rays, radiation, and solar flares. In other applications, satellites launched gave us accurate details about the Earth's topography. They provided live television and communications between continents. And pictures from space to aid weather forecasting. This solid fuel, Blue Scout, hurled a small gold-plated satellite deep into space to measure the uncharted regions of the Van Allen radiation belt. It was one of 5 launched in 1965. In another sharpshooting demonstration, an Air Force industry crew launched the third trio of nuclear detection satellites aboard an Atlas Agena.
2, 1, 0. Ignition.
The satellites were injected into separate orbiting positions to serve as electronic sentries in space. The programs at the Cape vary, but one basic mission has not changed: the development and refinement of weapon systems vital to the defense of the United States and the free world. Minuteman II, America's most advanced intercontinental ballistic missile, continued testing during 1965. SAC's operational version will have a striking range of over 7,000 miles. At the Eastern Test Range, the missile is fired to a target area near Ascension Island, approximately 5,000 miles away.
Holding momentarily. ATO switch to proceed. Proceed. Guidance monitor.
Number 1, go.
LSO.
LSO, go. -4, mark.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Seven Minuteman missiles were fired during 1965. All were successful. A different concept in weapon systems is the U.S. Navy's Polaris, launched from nuclear-powered submarines. Staging from Port Canaveral, each new submarine moves to a position 30 miles off the Cape coast to put both missile and crew through operational tests. The third-generation Polaris has a range of 2,800 miles. During 1965, there were 57 major launches from the Cape. Not so many as in previous years, but more demanding in the areas of launch support, tracking, and data gathering. Cape Kennedy, the downrange stations, and instrumented ships and aircraft make up the 10,000-mile-long Air Force Eastern Test Range. The growing complexity of space missions requires a massive amount of support from the range. Control of satellites, compiling of information for study of rocket performance, monitor and control to ensure safe operations during missile flight. Transition from a ballistic missile testing center to a space operations center will continue as the demands of the nation's most ambitious space program gathers momentum, landing an American on the moon by the end of the decade. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration proceeded on schedule toward that goal in 1965. The Ranger project, completed that year, provided the pictures of the moon's surface that prove there are areas smooth enough for a landing.
All launch commit lights are green.
All recorded to pass.
I have a commit arm light. Mark. Ignition.
The world saw on television what Ranger saw as it approached and hit the moon. But more information is needed for the manned landing in Project Apollo. Is the moon's surface solid enough to support the Apollo spacecraft? A NASA Surveyor spacecraft will find out. The Surveyor will be boosted into space by an Atlas Centaur. In a research and development test flight in March, a fuel valve malfunctioned and Centaur raised only a few feet. In a later flight, all systems perform perfectly, setting the stage for the Surveyor launching. . 1, developing and proving of the launch vehicle. Flight testing of the Saturn I series, which began in 1961, ended in 1965 with a 10 for 10 record. Each of the 1965 Saturns carried a huge satellite called Pegasus as a bonus payload. The giant spacecraft with a 96-foot wingspread made up of paper-thin aluminum panels is designed to unfold in space to detect and report the distribution, size, and velocity of tiny meteoroids hurtling through space. The final Saturn I with Pegasus aboard was launched on July 30th. Onboard television cameras show Pegasus spreading its giant wings in space. Keeping pace with the progress of Apollo is the development of the NASA facilities at the Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, just west of the Cape. The Saturn V Vehicle Assembly Building, the mobile launcher, and the crawlers for transporting the 365-foot-tall lunar rocket are rapidly nearing completion. Man on the moon is one direction. However, military capability in space is also required. The space booster to fit this need must be powerful enough to place heavy payloads into Earth orbit, be capable of maneuvering in space, have a support system designed for a fast launch rate, and yet be economical. The answer was the Air Force Titan III rocket, a combination of liquid and solid-fueled engines. In this new concept, liquid fuel stages are assembled as a core vehicle in one of 4 bays of the vertical integration building. The core vehicle is moved to the solid motor assembly building, where huge solid propellant boosters are attached. The entire assembly on its transporter, which serves as a launch platform, is then transferred to the pad. Several payloads can be carried aloft by the Titan IIIC and placed into different orbits by the versatile switch-engine trans-stage. Maneuverability in space is made possible by the unique third stage, which has a stop and restart capability in orbit. A streamlined countdown is conducted from the control center in the vertical integration building.
Electrical, go. Back in flight safety, go. AC spark plug, go. UTC, go. Engineering, go. ESO, go. SRO, go. The test wing authorized you to proceed with the launch of the Titan IIIC. Roger. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Over 2.5 million pounds of thrust and a trail of flame 600 feet long is generated by the solid fuel boosters as the Titan streaks skyward. In a weightlifting test, the first Titan III placed 21,000 pounds of lead payload into orbit. 2 later launches carried live experimental satellites. "28 miles up, the spent solid motors are ejected, and the liquid fuel core takes over. Future missions for the Titan III will include a variety of scientific and communication satellites and manned orbiting laboratories to determine man's military potential in space. The greatest and most dramatic of the space achievements in 1965, without doubt, were in Project Gemini, the second phase of America's manned spaceflight program. Gemini is a national effort, directed by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and supported by the Department of Defense in booster development, launch operations, tracking, recovery, bioastronautics, and providing flight crews. Television and radio networks spent several weeks re-establishing broadcast facilities at the Cape Press site for the first American manned spaceflight since the end of Project Mercury in 1963. Vice President Humphrey, chairman of the National Aeronautics and Space Council, flew in to observe this important first flight. Over 700 news media representatives from the U.S. and many foreign nations covered the event. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Gus Grissom, one of the original Mercury astronauts, and Navy Commander John Young, a newcomer, were America's first Gemini twins to fly. On March 23rd, the combined Air Force, NASA, industry blockhouse crew launched the Molly Brown spacecraft on its three-orbit flight.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
During the mission, the astronauts achieved a first by maneuvering their craft into a change of orbital plane, and then on re-entry, flew the Molly Brown to the selected landing area. The welcome home at the Cape and Cocoa Beach, Florida, was representative of the feeling of all America. GT-4, the second manned mission, followed close on the heels of GT-3. The flight date, June 3rd, was a month earlier than originally planned. Astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White were both new to space, but not new to flight. Both were crack Air Force test pilots. GT-3 was 3 orbits, 4 hours and 50 minutes. GT GT4 was committed to 62 revolutions, 4 full days. 4 hours and 29 minutes into the mission, Ed White made American history.
What's your status for EVA? Status is go for EVA. Flight Hawaii, Capcom. Go ahead. Roger, I understand our copy. He is outside of the spacecraft at this time. I don't know, we're coming over the west end. They want you to come back in now. Roger, we've been trying to talk to you for a while here. No, back in, come on. We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy.
The 2 space pilots received a boisterous welcome aboard the Navy's USS-1. GT5, the first real Gemini endurance test, 8 days in space, was scheduled in August, and again well ahead of the originally planned date. The endurance champion of the Mercury flights, L. Gordon Cooper, was selected as command pilot. Former Navy flyer Pete Conrad was chosen as co-pilot. After a 2-day slip, the launch was rescheduled, and Cape support forces again took position. After a perfect launch in good orbit, problems developed in a new power supply system, and the mission seemed to be in trouble. NASA Flight Director Christopher Kraft decided to continue the mission, evaluating the situation on a day-to-day basis. Department of Defense support and recovery forces throughout the world maintained an around-the-clock vigil should a sudden mission halt be called.
This is NBC News, the flight of Gemini 5.
This is CKSN's coverage of Gemini at T plus 106 hours and 55 minutes.
Cooper and Conrad continuing to streak around the globe at 5 miles a second, now well past the midpoint of their 8-day Gemini 5 mission.
Astronauts L. Gordon Cooper and Charles Pete Conrad are piloting their Gemini 5 spacecraft into the 69th revolution around Earth, headed for the world's manned space-time record, 7.5 orbits away.
Go for the full amount of 8 days as was scheduled earlier.
Mission complete. Proof of our growing space-age experience in meeting with unexpected situations in flight. GT6, the first rendezvous and docking mission, was scheduled for October. Astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford were already in their spacecraft when the Agena target vehicle atop an Atlas booster blasted from the old Mercury Complex 14. After approximately 6 minutes of flight, telemetry signals were lost. The Agena never achieved orbit. GT6 was scrubbed. The big question now was the effect it would have on the program schedule. Disappointment was short-lived. President Johnson announced an exciting alternative. GT7, a 14-day flight, was already on the board for a December launch. Confidence in the launch team was a well-established fact. These elements shaped a real challenge. launched GT-7 with astronauts Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, and within 14 days, launched the delayed GT-6 astronauts from the same pad to effect a close-in orbital rendezvous. GT-7, the first leg of the ambitious double Gemini mission, was launched on December 4th on its marathon 332-hour flight. While Lovell and Borman were still in their first orbit 185 miles above, the launch crew moved the Titan booster to the complex and worked around the clock to prepare GT-6 for its date in space. The fast turnaround was an unprecedented feat, and on December 15th, after a frustrating delay, Schirra and Stafford roared away for their rendezvous with GT-7. One 185 miles above the Pacific Ocean, Gemini 6 took a giant step forward for the United States as it maneuvered to within 1 foot of its sister spacecraft. An historic space-age first in the race to land men on the moon in this decade. 1965 was a year of achievement and fulfillment at Cape Kennedy, but the challenge ahead remains undiminished because man's move into space offers infinite promise.
Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Main engine start.
Right away, Houston.
In the 8th year of manned flight into space, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration prepared men and equipment for the most advanced manned mission to date. Apollo 8, NASA's 17th manned space flight, took 3 American astronauts on a far-reaching half-million-mile journey into orbit around the moon and back to Earth. The historic 6-day, 3-hour mission of Apollo 8 demonstrated the performance of many activities required for the success of future manned flights, including landing men on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. The performance of the Apollo Saturn V, America's most powerful space vehicle, was again demonstrated on this mission. The 3-stage Saturn V launch vehicle had been qualified for the Apollo 8 flight, its first manned mission, by 2 successful unmanned launches. The flight worthiness of the command and service modules of the Apollo spacecraft had been proven on previous missions, including the 11-day manned Earth orbital mission of the Apollo 7. The ability of man to function normally, to perform specific activities, and to navigate the Apollo spacecraft on a distant flight were demonstrated by the 3-man crew of Apollo 8. Frank Borman, a veteran of the Gemini program, was command pilot for the mission. James A. Lovell, who had participated in 2 Gemini flights, was command module pilot. And William A. Anders was lunar module pilot. NASA and crew confidence in the Apollo 8 mission was very high. Although difficult, it was one of the least complicated of possible lunar missions and was well within the design capabilities of the Apollo Saturn V space vehicle. The mission also contained several commit points, at which times mission control and the astronaut crew had options to proceed with the planned mission or, if necessary, switch to an alternate mission plan. In demonstrating the performance of the crew, the Apollo Saturn V space vehicle, and the mission support facilities on a manned lunar mission, Apollo 8 accomplished the first of its primary mission objectives. The second primary objective was concerned with planned activities performed during the mission, including translunar injection, command service module navigation, communications, and mid-course corrections, an assessment of fuel and other items consumed on the mission, and passive thermal control, that is, external temperature control of the command service modules in deep space. The 28-hour final countdown for Apollo 8 was begun on the night of December 19th by the manned launch operations team at Kennedy Space Center. The launch date for Apollo 8, set in November, was maintained throughout the rigorous checkout and countdown of the complex Apollo Saturn V space vehicle. In the early morning hours of December 21st, the 3-man crew of Apollo 8 boarded the NASA transfer van and began their journey to the launch pad at Complex 39. They arrived at the base of the pad about 3 hours before liftoff. Elevators carried the crew to the 320-foot level of the launch tower, from where they crossed the Apollo access arm and entered the White Room. With monitors in the Launch Control Center indicating all spacecraft and launch vehicle systems functioning normally, the astronauts entered the spacecraft. The countdown proceeded smoothly with no unscheduled holds. About 4 minutes before liftoff, the last manual check of all launch consoles was completed. At T-minus 3 minutes and 7 seconds, an automatic sequencer took over the countdown. As the clock reached T-minus 8 and 9/10 seconds, the engines of the first stage were ignited. million-pound Apollo Saturn space vehicle slowly rose from its launch pad and then climbed into space at an accelerating speed. Liftoff of Apollo 8 was recorded at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, precisely on schedule. The launch azimuth was exactly 72 degrees.
Apollo 6 program.
Roger.
How do you hear, Houston?
Loud and clear. Mark, mode 1 Bravo, Apollo 8.
Mode 1B.
Apollo 8, you're looking good.
Roger.
At an altitude of 36 miles, the center engine of the first stage shut down.
Houston, you are go for
28 seconds later, the 4 outside engines shut down and separation of the stages took place.
All Roger, understand, sir.
Houston, how do you read Apollo 8?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear, Apollo 8.
Okay, the first stage was very smooth, and this one is smoother.
Understand, smoother and smoother. Looks good here. Apollo 8, Houston, you're looking good. Apollo 8, Houston, trajectory and guidance look good, over.
Roger, Apollo 8's good here.
The 1 million-pound thrust of the second stage raised the speed and altitude of Apollo 8 to 6,800 miles per hour, 106 miles above Earth. At 8 minutes 44 seconds into the flight, Mission Control in Houston, Texas, confirmed second stage shutdown and separation. The third stage was then ignited for the first time to place itself and the Apollo spacecraft, a 283,000-pound payload, into a planned 119-mile-high Earth parking orbit. During 2 revolutions of the Earth, the crew checked spacecraft and launch vehicle systems in preparation for reignition of the third stage and insertion into a lunar trajectory. A similar check was conducted at Mission Control. This was the first commit point in the flight. After careful evaluation of all, Mission Control gave the go-ahead for translunar insertion.
Apollo 8, Houston, you're looking good here, right down the center line.
Roger, Apollo 8.
Apollo 8 coming up on 20 seconds to ignition. Mark it, and you're looking very good.
Roger. Ignition.
Roger, ignition.
The third stage engine was reignited at 2 hours, 50 minutes, and 36 seconds into the flight. The engine burned for 5 minutes and 19 seconds, raising Apollo 8's speed to a velocity of 24,200 miles per hour, thrusting Apollo from Earth orbit toward the moon. For the first time, man had left his home planet to begin a translunar flight through space. The third stage had performed its function perfectly, and 20 minutes after translunar insertion, spacecraft separation occurred. Following a short period of station keeping, the spacecraft moved away in preparation for third stage fuel dump. The remaining liquid oxygen in the third stage was then released, which increased the velocity of the stage on a new trajectory. This eliminated the possibility of recontact with the spacecraft by placing the stage in a trajectory passing behind the moon and into solar orbit. At 6 hours and 33 minutes into the flight, the astronauts tested the S-band high-gain steerable antenna. Flown for the first time, this small 70-inch wide antenna was used for most of the two-way transmissions between the spacecraft and Mission Control. The small antenna performed better than predicted. In contrast, at 3 points on Earth, Huge 85-foot antenna stations were used for all telemetry, voice communications, and TV transmissions up to lunar distances. Passive thermal control of the spacecraft was then initiated and maintained throughout the mission except during periods of navigation sightings, photography, and television transmissions. Thermal control is vital to the success of distant manned space flight and involves rotating the spacecraft slowly so that excessive heat will not build up on the surface facing the sun. A short time later, the crew removed their pressure suits. They wore lightweight flight suits throughout the remainder of the mission. The first mid-course correction maneuver was initiated at 11 hours. A 2.4-second burn of the service propulsion engine increased the spacecraft velocity by 24.5 feet per second. The resulting trajectory was so accurate that the planned second and third maneuvers were not required. Command pilot Borman experienced some nausea at 19 hours. The two other crewmen also reported a feeling of queasiness. Following medication and a sleep period, all three men felt well and rested. They experienced no further physical problems. The first of 6 television transmissions was initiated on the second day of the flight at about 31 hours.
Apollo 8, Houston, we just got it.
You aren't getting it.
He's on candid camera. Very good. Okay, Apollo 8, we have a good picture.
We're rolling her.
Shot
Okay, we're rolling around to a good view of the Earth, and as soon as we get to the good view of the Earth, we'll stop and let you look out the window at the scene we see. Jim Lovell's down in the lower equipment bay preparing lunch, and Bill is holding a camera here for us both.
Throughout the translunar flight, the astronauts conducted star, Earth horizon, and lunar sightings to demonstrate the accuracy of onboard navigation and evaluate the optical subsystem for future deep space manned missions. For the first time, man took photographs of the receding Earth, as well as many of the approach to the moon. During the translunar flight, the Earth's gravitational pull gradually decreased Apollo 8's velocity to 2,170 miles per hour. Then, as lunar gravity overcame the Earth's diminishing pull, spacecraft velocity increased. As Apollo 8 neared the moon, another extensive evaluation of all systems was conducted by the crew and mission control. If no further maneuvers were made, the spacecraft would circle the moon and head back to Earth on a free return trajectory. However, mission control and the astronauts decided to commit for lunar orbit. On Christmas Eve, at 69 hours and 8 minutes, the service module propulsion system was fired to deboost the spacecraft into lunar orbit. The initial elliptical orbit was 69 by 193 miles above the lunar surface. After a complete systems check and confirmation from mission control, a second burn of the service propulsion system engine circularized the orbit to a planned 69 miles above the moon. For the first time, man looked upon the surface of the moon with his unaided eyes and saw greater detail than ever before.
Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
Okay, Houston, the moon is essentially gray. No color. Looks like plaster of Paris. Or sort of a grayish beach sand. We can see quite a bit of detail. The Sea of Fertility doesn't stand out as well here as it does back on Earth. Not much contrast between that and the surrounding craters. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Some look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort.
These history-making scenes were transmitted to the world via television from Apollo 8 in orbit of the moon.
Roger. And I can see the rays coming out of Blaze Pickering. We're coming up now near our B1 initial site, which I'm going to try and see. Be advised, the round window, the hatch window, is completely iced over and we cannot use it. Bill Meyer is showing a rendezvous window.
Apollo 8 Houston, Roger. Got any more information on those rays, over?
During lunar orbit, the astronauts were out of communication contact for about 45 minutes each time they moved behind the moon. On the dark side of the moon, tracking and general photography of the lunar surface was performed. On the light side of the moon, lunar landmark sightings and tracking of potential landing areas for future missions were conducted. A huge crater and other prominent Lorraine features were photographed, including a high mountain in the center of a crater on the back side of the moon. The astronauts also turned their cameras toward a bright object on the horizon, the Earth, shining in space, with much more brightness than the moonshine we've seen so often from our planet. After 10 lunar revolutions, a total of about 20 hours in lunar orbit, the astronauts prepared for trans-Earth injection and return to their home planet. Reignition of the service propulsion system to escape the pull of lunar gravity was critical. On the backside of the moon, at 89 hours 19 minutes, on prior direction from Mission Control, the astronauts fired the engine of the service module for 203 seconds. It was Christmas morning on Earth, and the nation waited for recontact with the astronauts.
Apollo 8 Houston. Apollo 8 Houston.
Houston, Apollo 8, over.
Hello, Apollo 8. Loud and clear.
Roger. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
That's affirmative. You're the best ones to know.
And bird status report. We burned on...
Man had orbited the moon and looked upon its surface. He had tracked and photographed potential landing sites for future manned missions. He had accomplished the age-old dream of traveling to the moon, and now was on his way home to Earth. During the 2-day, 9-hour return trip to Earth, additional navigational sightings were performed and communication and thermal control tests conducted. Apollo 8's primary guidance and navigation system was operated automatically for controlling the spacecraft's return trajectory. Mission Control updated return course information to the command module computer at least every 10 hours. A planned mid-course correction was initiated at the 15th hour of trans-Earth flight. A velocity correction of only 5 feet per second ensured entry into the Earth's atmosphere within the mathematically computed Earth entry corridor. Again, because of the accuracy of the trajectory, planned second and third corrections were not required.
As I look down on the Earth here so far out in space, I think I must have the feeling that the travelers in the old sailing ships used to have. We've gone on a very long voyage away from home, and now we're headed back. And I have that feeling of being proud of the trip, but still happy to be going back home and back to our home port. This is Frank Borman. We've enjoyed the television shows, and invite you to stay tuned in the future, because there'll be flights in rendezvous in the Earth orbit, and then of course there'll be television from the lunar surface itself in the not too far distant future. So until then, I guess this is
On December 27th, as Apollo 8 approached Earth, the spacecraft was manually maneuvered in preparation for separation from the service module. 15 minutes before atmospheric entry, the command module separated from the service module. The spacecraft was then automatically maneuvered to the proper attitude for entry. Traveling 24,530 miles per hour, Apollo 8 began Earth entry 7.5 miles above the western Pacific Ocean. As Apollo 8 streaked through the Pacific night, an airborne camera photographed the blazing trail of the spacecraft and its ablative material. Following a direct descent flight path, Apollo 8 traveled 1,560 miles across the Earth's surface and splashed down in the Pacific with pinpoint accuracy, less than 4 miles from its recovery ship. The first night landing of a manned spacecraft brought the epical lunar journey to an end with the precision that characterized the entire mission. Apollo 8 had splashed down on target and on schedule at 6 days, 2 hours, and 59 minutes after liftoff. On man's first flight to the moon, all primary mission objectives had been completely accomplished. Every detailed test objective had been met, as well as 5 which were not originally planned. While overwhelming praise was given to astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders for their historic accomplishment, just praise was also given to the Apollo launch and mission teams, who had coped with many difficult constraints in carrying out the complicated launch and mission. Apollo 8 climaxed a year of manned spaceflight progress and demonstrated with awesome perfection the capability of United States crews and equipment to fly into space beyond the equilibrium point of the Earth's gravitational pull. With the historic flight of Apollo 8 to the moon and back in the closing days of 1968, mankind entered a new era of unlimited dimensions, and the United States became truly a spacefaring nation. It was 4 days before Christmas 1968. An Apollo Saturn space vehicle stood poised at Kennedy Space Center, ready for the first manned flight to the moon. 3 American astronauts, Mission Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot James Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot Bill Anders, would be the first men to travel over 250,000 miles away from their home planet to orbit the moon. Thousands of persons were on hand to view the liftoff of America's most powerful rocket. The countdown reached ignition precisely on schedule. Every maneuver of the complex space vehicle was accomplished as planned during the 3-day journey from Earth to the moon. On Christmas Eve, the astronauts placed their spacecraft into lunar orbit. The spacemen reveled in the achievement of their goal and sent a special message to the people on Earth.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and
and divided the waters which were under the firmament, the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning was the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Apollo 10, man's second journey to orbit the moon, was a full-scale rehearsal of all of the activities required to land men on the lunar surface, except for the actual landing, which is scheduled for the next Apollo mission. Specifically, the 8-day, 3-minute mission was a final test of the descent and ascent stages of the lunar module in lunar orbit, the environment for which it was designed. The mission provided the maximum operational experience with the lunar module before committing to a lunar landing. To carry out the detailed objectives of this mission, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration selected 3 veteran astronauts as the crew of Apollo 10. The command pilot, Thomas P. Stafford, had flown on 2 Gemini missions, as had the command module pilot, John W. Young. Eugene A. Cernan, the lunar pilot, had flown with Stafford on the Gemini 9 mission. Charlie Brown was selected by the astronauts as the code name for the Apollo 10 command module, and his friend Snoopy was the call sign for the lunar module. Of significant importance at Launch Complex 39 of the Kennedy Space Center was that Apollo 10 was the first space vehicle launched from Pad B. The 4 previous Apollo Saturn V space vehicles had been launched from Pad A. Also, in the Launch Control Center at Complex 39, a 3rd firing room was used for the first time. The utilization of these facilities brought Complex 39 to a full operational level with a dual launch pad capability. The final countdown for Apollo 10 was begun on May 17th and proceeded without any major holds. Dr. Kurt Debus and Rocco Petrone headed the launch team. Following fueling of the mighty Saturn launch vehicle and the Apollo spacecraft, the 3 astronauts arrived at the launch pad. At T-minus 2 hours and 40 minutes, the crew entered the White Room atop the launch tower and prepared to board the spacecraft. The final countdown events were monitored by some 550 government and industry personnel in the Launch Control Center. These included Dr. George E. Miller, head of the Manned Spaceflight Program, Lieutenant General Sam Phillips, director of the Apollo program, and Dr. Werner von Braun, director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, which developed the Saturn V launch vehicle. The Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, and a number of national and international dignitaries were also present at the Space Center to witness the launch of the Apollo moon rocket. These included the King and Queen of Belgium and many United States senators and congressmen. The launch date and liftoff time for Apollo 10, established 4 months before launch, were selected to obtain the same lighting conditions on the moon that will be required for the actual first lunar landing mission. As the clock approached 12:49 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, May 18, 1969, the countdown for the moon-bound Apollo 10 space vehicle reached ignition precisely on schedule.
Counting, guidance internal, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. Engines on, 5, 4, 3, 2, all engines running.
Roger, roll. Your go, trajectory and guidance look good.
Roger, we look right on the line on board.
Your go for staging, 10.
Roger, finish go.
What a ride, babe, what a ride. Right.
Man, that staging was quite a sequence.
Right, sounded like it.
The three-stage Saturn V launch vehicle performed perfectly to place Apollo 10 into an Earth parking orbit of 117 by 114 miles after 12 minutes of flight. Mission Control in Houston, Texas, confirmed that all space vehicle systems were functioning as planned. The Mission Control team was headed by Dr. Robert Gilruth and Chris Kraft. Midway through the second revolution of the Earth, as Apollo 10 passed over Australia, the third stage was reignited to place Apollo 10 into a free return lunar trajectory. For the second time in history, 3 men had left their home planet on a journey to the moon. After leaving Earth orbit, the astronauts began preparation for command service module separation, transposition, and docking with the lunar module to remove it from the third stage. These maneuvers were accomplished as planned and were broadcast to the world via a color TV camera aboard the command module. This was the first live color TV transmission from a manned spacecraft.
Be docked in a second, I hope. Roger. 10, Houston, you're looking good. We can see the markings in the rendezvous in it. Looks like you just docked.
Roger, we got a capture. You haven't fired yet.
Roger. Gene, we can read the numbers on the limb docking window.
Snap, snap, and we're there. Got 2 grays.
Roger. You're still on the docket, Charlie.
We didn't get any master alarm. Everything looks snug.
Roger. Didn't look like there was any, hardly any post-docking oscillations.
Yep.
The docking was completed at 3 hours and 10 minutes into the mission. The lunar module was then separated from the third stage of the launch vehicle. After a planned evasive maneuver, the fuel remaining in the third stage was released, propelling the spent stage into a new trajectory which carried it away from the path of the spacecraft and into an orbit around the sun.
That zoom was real good. We have the S4B. The sun's real bright on it.
How's the focus?
Hey, it looks real good.
Hello, Houston, Apollo 10.
Go ahead, 10.
Roger. I wish you'd tell Dr. Von Braun, Lee James, Kurt Davis, and Rocco Patron, thanks a lot, and all the people who worked on it for the great ride.
Roger. We're going out to the networks now, I think. It's probably heard it. We'll pass it on, though.
Yeah, the few thousand people worked on that machine, and we sure appreciate it.
Roger. Look beautiful from here.
The accuracy of the translunar insertion maneuver was such that only one mid-course correction of a possible 4 was necessary on the 250,000-mile flight to the moon.
Hey, boy, that is really fantastic. We can pick out Baja and the smog over L.A., and we see Mexico, and we go off to the east in our picture and come into the Rockies area. The Baja California and the Gulf area really stand out beautiful. We can see Mexico
and the clouds up over the Rockies. It's really a fantastic sight. Okay, this has got to be the greatest sight ever.
You ought to see it up here.
During the flight, the spacecraft was placed into a slow roll, known as passive thermal control. The maneuver ensured that the intense heat of the sun would not build up on one side of the spacecraft during the flight to and from the moon. On the third day of the mission, as Apollo 10 approached the moon, the main engine was again ignited to slow the spacecraft, allowing it to be pulled into orbit of the moon by lunar gravity. The initial elliptical lunar orbit was 195 by 68 miles. After 2 revolutions, this was changed to a near circular orbit 69 miles above the moon.
And the landing site for Apollo 11 will land, and I'll go back and zoom in on that again. Over. Roger. Okay, there's Censorinus. Over here is the crater Moki. Up on the masculine bay. We come down here to a little bright crater there. It's right near the tip of the Oklahoma foothills there. It's called Moki, and to the left, right in this area, is the landing site where Apollo 11 should land. Over.
Okay, we got them all, Tom. They're coming through real good.
Later on the same day, astronaut Cernan transferred to the lunar module for the first time to check out and prepare it for subsequent operations. At the completion of this activity, he returned to the command module. As the Apollo 10 crew rested in lunar orbit, activity on Earth at America's spaceport continued at a high level. On the day before Apollo 10 reached the moon, the Apollo 11 space vehicle had been moved from the assembly building to Launch Pad A at Complex 39. At the same time, key officials of NASA's Apollo program met at the Space Center. Lieutenant General Sam Phillips met with program managers from the field centers to review preparations for the Apollo 11 mission. Dr. George Miller met with members of the President's Scientific Advisory Committee and members of the Science and Technology Advisory Committee to discuss Apollo 11 and the future manned spaceflight program. Launch pad checkout of the space vehicle, destined to land 2 American astronauts on the moon, was well underway on the day of the final test of Apollo's lunar module in orbit above the moon. The critical Apollo 10 maneuvers began on the 4th day of the mission, when astronauts Stafford and Cernan entered the lunar module. They activated its systems, deployed the landing gear, and prepared to undock from the command module. On direction from Mission Control, a short burn of the service module's small engines was initiated to separate the lunar module from its mothership. The 2 spacecraft moved 30 feet apart and maintained station keeping for 1/2 hour, while the command module pilot maneuvered his spacecraft around the lunar module to visually inspect its exterior. Then, with all systems in order and functioning as planned, the lunar module's descent engine was fired to place it into a descent trajectory. This brought the lunar module down to an altitude of 47,000 feet, or about 9 miles above the Sea of Tranquility, the closest man has ever been to the lunar surface. During the descent, the lunar landing radar system aboard the LEM performed as anticipated. Communication from the low point of the lunar module orbit, however, was relatively poor. This problem is being studied and will be corrected prior to the landing mission.
Hey, and I'll tell you, we are low. We are close, Dave. This is like it. And it really looks pretty smooth down there, surprisingly enough. And this Salinas Bay has huge boulders all around the rim of it, falling on the inside and outside.
Until this time, Apollo 10 had duplicated each step of an actual lunar landing mission. Shortly after passing the site selected for the first manned lunar landing, the descent engine was fired to thrust the module away from the moon's surface. This was a maneuver to establish a lead angle or distance between the 2 spacecraft equivalent to the rendezvous distance of an actual landing mission. The maneuver placed the lunar module into an elliptical orbit of 218 by 9 miles, while the command service module remained in a circular orbit. During the elliptical orbit, the two Apollo 10 spacecraft were as far as 414 miles apart. This provided an in-flight test of the Apollo rendezvous radar at maximum range. As the lunar module again approached the low point in its orbit, staging was initiated. The descent stage, which will be used on a landing mission for the actual touchdown and provide a launch platform for liftoff, was separated from the ascent stage. Immediately after staging, an unexpected maneuver occurred due to a procedural problem. Commander Stafford immediately took over manual control of the lunar module ascent stage and corrected the situation. The ascent propulsion system was then fired as planned to place the ascent stage into a 52 by 13 mile orbit. The staging and ascent maneuver simulated liftoff from the lunar surface after a landing mission. At the high point in this orbit, the small maneuvering engines were fired to place the lunar module into a 52-mile high circular orbit. The lunar module was now 17 miles below and 169 miles behind the command module. After coasting for 38 minutes, the small engines were fired again to complete rendezvous with the command module. The highly successful docking of the ascent stage with the command module was accomplished smoothly, expeditiously, and on schedule at 106 hours and 33 minutes into the mission. Stafford and Cernan then returned through the connecting tunnel to the command module. They had spent more than 8 hours flying the lunar module around the moon. The ascent stage was then jettisoned by the crew. At a signal from ground command, its engine was burned to propellant depletion, thrusting the ascent stage away from the command module into solar orbit. Ground contact was maintained with the ascent stage until its batteries were depleted some 12 hours later. During this period, numerous tests of ascent stage systems were conducted from mission control. The Apollo 10 flight plan again differed from that plan for the landing mission in that Apollo 10 spent an extra day in lunar orbit conducting lunar landmark tracking and extensive scientific photography. This included detailed stereo and oblique photos of potential landing sites on the lunar surface. Deep canyons or rills, massive craters, and majestic mountain ranges were photographed. This photo of the Sea of Tranquility shows the smooth area where two Apollo 11 astronauts will soon land and set foot upon the moon. After orbiting the moon 31 times, the Apollo 10 crew prepared to fire the spacecraft's main engine to escape lunar gravity. The burn was initiated on the 5th day of the mission on the backside of the moon. The burn was so accurately targeted and executed that only one minor course correction was required during the 240,000-mile return trip to ensure entry into the Earth's atmosphere at the proper angle. Another space first was accomplished on the mission when all three crewmen enjoyed their first shave in space, using the old reliable safety razor and brushless shaving cream. A final TV transmission from Apollo 10 included scenes of their approach to the good Earth. In the pre-dawn hours of May 26th, Apollo 10 entered the Earth's atmosphere as planned over the Pacific Ocean. Entry speed was calculated by computers to be 24,760 miles per hour, the fastest any human beings have ever flown. The path of the spacecraft was so accurate that entry and parachute deployment were photographed from its recovery ship. The 8-day, 750,000-mile journey of Apollo 10 was completed on schedule at 12:52 Eastern Daylight Time as the command module splashed down within 3 miles of the helicopter carrier USS Princeton. As the sun rose over the Pacific, the men who had traveled to the moon were hoisted aboard the recovery helicopter and transported to the Princeton. The complete success of the critical test flight of Apollo 10 proved all systems of the Apollo space vehicle and the launch and mission control team ready for lunar landing operations. The men of Apollo 10 and their predecessors in the manned space program had performed their job well. The stage was set and waiting for the Apollo 11 crew to make the first epical manned landing on the lunar surface, the ultimate goal of the Apollo program.